I am Julian, and I am 34 years old. Just last Thanksgiving, right as the turkey was being carved and the wine was being poured, my father looked me dead in the eye and announced he was stripping away my inheritance to give it to my golden child brother. He did this in front of our entire extended family, raising his crystal wine glass to toast my brother's supposed brilliance while openly and ruthlessly mocking my career and my life choices. While I sat there, quietly eating my dinner, my parents told over 20 different relatives that my brother Marcus was a real man who built real things, while I was just a low-level government paper pusher who lacked ambition, drive, and vision. They laughed at my expense. My aunts and uncles nodded in agreement, looking at me with that sickening, unforgettable mix of pity and absolute disdain. But there was one massive, catastrophic detail they didn't know. They didn't know that my brother's luxury real estate empire was a complete and utter fraud. They didn't know that the anonymous angel investor who had been keeping him out of federal prison and funding his lavish lifestyle for the last 3 years was actually me. And they certainly didn't know that I had just quietly reached into my pocket, pulled out my phone, and pressed send on a secure email that would completely bankrupt him before dessert was even served. Now, after the dust has settled, they are the ones begging for my help, facing the total collapse of their pristine image. Before I tell you exactly how I dismantled my family's toxic dynamic piece by piece and took back what was rightfully mine, hit that like button if you believe that karma always comes to collect its debts. And don't forget to let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Now, let's go back to the exact moment the fuse was lit. The dining room of my parents' house in suburban San Antonio smelled of roasted turkey, expensive sage stuffing, and absolute, suffocating hypocrisy. It was a crisp November afternoon in Texas. The kind of day where the air bites just enough to make the grand stone fireplace in their living room feel welcoming. We were all gathered around my mother's massive, antique mahogany dining table, a table that had been the stage for countless family dramas over the decades. Aunt Clara was there, wearing far too much floral perfume and a judgment in her eyes that never quite faded. Uncle Robert was already on his 3rd glass of top-shelf scotch, his face flushed red as he loudly debated golf swings. And sitting at the head of the table, right next to my beaming, fiercely proud father, was Marcus. Marcus is 3 years older than me, and he has spent every single one of those 37 years making sure everyone in a 50-mile radius knows exactly how successful he is. He is the CEO and founder of Harrison Properties. He wears custom Italian suits that cost more than some cars, flashes a heavy gold Rolex that catches the light every time he gestures, and drives a brand-new, jet-black Porsche. To my parents, he is the ultimate American dream realized. He is the sun, and the rest of us are just planets lucky enough to orbit his greatness. I, on the other hand, arrived at the dinner wearing a plain gray cashmere sweater and dark denim jeans. I intentionally took my seat near the end of the table, closest to the kitchen door, blending into the background as I always did. I watched the spectacle unfold with a quiet detachment. The clinking of silverware slowed as my father stood up. He picked up his wine glass and tapped his silver fork against it. The sharp, clear ringing sound cut through the loud chatter of the extended family, demanding total silence. "Family," my father began, puffing out his chest and looking around the room with the practiced gaze of a politician. "As you all know, since Grandfather Harrison passed away 2 years ago, the future of the family ranch has been up in the air. The 800-acre estate out in the hill country has been in our bloodline for 4 generations. It is a legacy of hard work, of grit, and of unparalleled vision. After much deliberation, countless late nights, and meetings with the estate lawyer, Eleanor and I have made a final decision regarding who will take over the property and carry our name into the future." He paused for dramatic effect. He let the silence hang in the air so heavily you could choke on it. Then, he looked down the long expanse of the mahogany table, past my uncles, past my cousins, landing his eyes directly on me. His gaze was cold, dismissive, and utterly devoid of warmth. "We are turning the deed over to Marcus," my father announced, his voice booming with pride. My mother gasped in delight and clapped her hands together, actual tears of joy welling in her carefully made-up eyes. She reached over and squeezed Marcus's arm. The rest of the table erupted into polite, enthusiastic applause. It just makes perfect sense, my father continued, projecting his voice so even the neighbors could probably hear the greatness of his firstborn. Marcus knows land. He knows development. He actually works hard and builds things that matter to the community. He has the entrepreneurial spirit of this family running through his veins. My father sighed heavily then, a theatrical, exaggerated display of disappointment designed entirely for my benefit. Julian, he said, shaking his head slightly, we know you have your comfortable little government desk job. You push papers. It's safe. It pays the bills and gives you a modest salary. But the ranch needs a visionary. It needs someone who isn't afraid to take risks, to get their hands dirty, and to maximize real estate value. Your brother has proven he can do that. I know you understand. Aunt Clara leaned over to me from the adjacent seat, placing a patronizing, heavy hand on my shoulder. Don't feel bad, Julian, she cooed loudly enough for the whole room to hear. We can't all be CEOs and millionaires. Someone has to do the boring paperwork and manage the files. There is honor in an honest day's work, even if it's invisible. I didn't blink. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't let a single ounce of the raging inferno inside my chest show on my face. I simply picked up my phone from my lap, unlocked the screen with my thumb, and opened my secure, encrypted email client. I typed a single, brief message to David, my personal wealth manager sitting in an office thousands of miles away. Execute the Harrison Properties withdrawal. All $7.1 million. Now, I hit send. I slipped the phone back into my pocket, picked up my crystal water goblet, and took a slow, methodical sip. Congratulations, Marcus, I said. My voice was completely flat, an emotionless void. I'm sure you have big plans for the land. Marcus smirked, leaning back in his grand dining chair like a king surveying his conquered subjects. Huge plans, little brother, he gloated. I'm going to bulldoze that rotting old barn, pave over the creek we used to play in, and put up 65 ultra-luxury homes. The profit margins are going to be astronomical once we rezone it. It's all about maximizing assets and knowing what things are truly worth. Maximizing assets, I repeated quietly, letting the words hang in the air between us. Exactly 1 minute and 40 seconds after I sent that email, the festive, self-congratulatory silence of the dining room was violently shattered by a harsh, aggressive buzzing sound. It was Marcus's phone. It was vibrating violently against the polished mahogany wood, disrupting my mother's attempt to pass the gravy boat. He glanced at the screen, rolled his eyes playfully for the audience, and silenced it. Work never sleeps when you're at the top, he chuckled. 10 seconds later, it rang again. This time, it wasn't the standard vibration. It was a different ringtone, the urgent, shrill, piercing sound he exclusively assigned to his chief financial officer. Marcus frowned, his thick eyebrows knitting together. He picked it up. Victor, I'm in the middle of Thanksgiving dinner with my family. This better be a matter of life and death. He put the phone to his ear. I sat perfectly still and watched as the color drained entirely from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, ashen gray. The smug, arrogant CEO mask slipped off in real time, replaced by raw, unadulterated primal panic. He stood up so fast his heavy wooden chair scraped loudly against the hardwood floor, causing Aunt Clara to jump. What do you mean the escrow account is empty? Marcus hissed into the receiver, his voice cracking, entirely forgetting his audience. What do you mean the capital is gone? That's impossible. To understand the sheer magnitude of the shockwave that was about to hit that dining room table, you have to understand the elaborate, exhausting lie I had been living for a decade. My family genuinely, wholeheartedly believed I was a low-level administrative clerk. For years, whenever we gathered for holidays or birthdays and they asked about my career, I gave vague, boring answers about compliance protocols, documentation filing, and municipal zoning codes. I let them believe I was making $60,000 a year clipping coupons, and struggling to build a basic 401k for a retirement I would barely be able to afford. It was just easier that way. In my early 20s, I had tried to tell them the truth. I had tried to share my ambitions. But every time I opened my mouth to talk about finance or markets, my father would abruptly interrupt me to talk about Marcus's latest brilliant idea for a startup, or my mother would change the subject to how handsome Marcus looked in his new suit. Eventually, I learned the hardest lesson a son can learn. They didn't want to know me. They only wanted an audience for Marcus. So, I stopped trying, and I faded into the wallpaper. The reality of my life was something they couldn't even fathom. I am not a paper pusher. I am a senior vice president of strategic acquisitions at one of the largest, most aggressive private equity firms in North America. My job isn't filing municipal permits. My job is analyzing, structuring, and executing commercial real estate transactions and corporate buyouts worth hundreds of millions of dollars. I deal with hostile takeovers, massive asset liquidations, and high-stakes negotiations that determine the fate of entire corporations. I have a massive corner office with panoramic, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Austin skyline. My performance bonus alone last year was more money than my father had earned in his entire lifetime of middle management sales. Richard, the ruthless CEO of my firm, once sat across from me after a grueling 48-hour negotiation and told me I had the coldest blood of anyone he had ever met in the industry. "You don't let emotion cloud the spreadsheet, Julian," Richard had said, swirling a glass of scotch after I successfully dismantled a failing tech company's real estate portfolio and sold it off in pieces. "You see the numbers, you see the weakness, and you execute without hesitation. That is exactly why you win. That is why you are my top guy." But Richard was wrong about one thing. When it came to my own family, I had a massive, glaring blind spot. I still craved their approval. I still desperately wanted them to be okay. 3 years ago, Grandfather Harrison called me out to the family ranch. It was late afternoon, the Texas sun casting long, golden shadows over the grazing cattle and the endless fields of bluebonnets. Grandfather was a tough, leather-skinned, self-made man who had built his fortune from the dirt up. He didn't care about flashy Italian suits, country club memberships, or who drove the newest car. He cared about integrity. He cared about substance. We sat on the wraparound porch of the old farmhouse, the wooden swing creaking gently as we nursed 2 glasses of his finest neat whiskey. "Your father thinks you're a pencil pusher," Grandfather said suddenly, his gravelly voice cutting through the sounds of the cicadas. He didn't take his eyes off the horizon. I smiled bitterly, staring down at my amber drink. "I know, Grandfather. Let him think what he wants." "Your father is a damn fool," the old man grunted angrily. He reached down beside his rocking chair and pulled out a thick, heavy manila folder. He tossed it onto the small wooden table between us with a loud thud. "I don't buy the act, Julian. I had my lawyers look into you. I know about the promotion to vice president. I know about the massive Dallas commercial merger you spearheaded last year. You've got a sharper mind for business than anyone else in this entire bloodline." I stared at him, utterly stunned, the glass freezing halfway to my lips. "You investigated me? I protect my investments," he replied sharply, turning to look me dead in the eye. "And this land, this ranch, this is my greatest investment. Marcus is a peacock. He talks a big game, he takes out loans he can't afford, and he builds houses that look pretty but have no solid foundation. He's hollow. If I leave this land to him, or to your father who enables his every whim, it will be subdivided, paved over, and sold off to the highest bidder before my body is even cold." Grandfather tapped a calloused finger against the thick folder. "This is an irrevocable trust. I've already signed it. The deed to this ranch, the mineral rights, the livestock, the equipment, everything is in your name. You are the sole legal beneficiary. But I am putting a strict lock on it. You cannot reveal this to your parents until after I am gone, and only when the time is absolutely right. I want you to see exactly who they are and how they treat you when they think they hold all the cards." I felt a massive lump form in my throat, choking off my air. It was the very first time in my entire life that someone in my family had truly seen me. Not as a shadow to Marcus, not as the disappointing second son, but as myself. "Thank you, grandfather," I whispered, gripping the folder tightly. But my inherent loyalty to my bloodline was a fatal flaw that would soon cost me dearly. 2 years ago, shortly after grandfather passed away and we attended his funeral, Marcus launched Harrison Properties. He was arrogant, deeply aggressive, and entirely out of his depth. Within 8 months, his lack of experience caught up with him. He was on the brink of total bankruptcy. He had over-leveraged his properties, taken out high-interest, predatory loans, and his suppliers were threatening to walk off the job sites. My parents were frantic. They mortgaged their own house to help him, draining their retirement funds and the small college fund they had saved for their future grandchildren. But it wasn't enough to plug the sinking ship. Sitting in my high-rise office, looking secretly at the public financial models of my brother's doomed company, I made a decision born out of deep guilt and a misplaced sense of brotherly duty. I contacted David, my personal wealth manager. I instructed him to set up a complex blind trust routed through a shell company in Delaware. Through that untraceable entity, I quietly injected $7.1 million of my own hard-earned money into Harrison Properties as an anonymous angel investor. I didn't do it to get credit or praise. I did it because I didn't want my parents to lose their home to foreclosure. I wanted Marcus to finally succeed and stabilize. I genuinely thought the massive capital injection would give him the breathing room he desperately needed to hire competent accountants, fix his broken supply chain, and build a legitimate, lasting business. For 2 whole years, the plan seemed to work flawlessly. Marcus became the darling of the local business magazines. He bought his jet black Porsche. He got engaged to Chloe, a woman who seemed to love the reflection of the massive diamond on her finger more than the man who actually gave it to her. My parents bragged endlessly about his financial genius at every gathering. I stayed quiet, attending family dinners in my plain clothes, playing the part of the boring, unsuccessful younger brother while secretly keeping the entire family afloat. I thought I had done the right, noble thing. I thought I had saved my family from ruin. I was so incredibly, devastatingly wrong. The grand illusion shattered into a million jagged pieces exactly 8 months ago. It was a rainy Tuesday morning. I was in my office reviewing a stack of acquisitions when Sarah, our lead forensic accountant, knocked sharply on my glass door. Sarah is terrifyingly brilliant and notoriously humorless. When she walks into a room carrying a red folder, it means someone is about to lose their company, or worse, go to federal prison. She walked in without waiting for an invitation and dropped the thick red folder directly onto the center of my desk. "We need to pass on the Harrison Properties acquisition immediately," she said flatly, taking a seat in the leather chair opposite my desk and crossing her arms. My firm had been looking at acquiring a large portfolio of boutique residential developments across Texas, and Marcus's company happened to be on the short list of targets. Because of strict conflict of interest policies and SEC regulations, I had completely recused myself from the vetting process. I hadn't looked at his books. I trusted my team to evaluate his firm objectively. "Why?" I asked, keeping my voice perfectly neutral, though my heart rate spiked. Sarah opened the folder and began sliding documents across the polished wood of my desk. Bank statements, supply invoices, wire transfer logs, and internal emails. "Because Harrison Properties isn't a real estate development firm, Julian," she said, looking me dead in the eye. "It's a massive, textbook Ponzi scheme." The air in the room suddenly felt very thin. I stared at the papers. "Explain." "Your brother is running a sophisticated shell game," Sarah said, pointing her pen to a highlighted column of red numbers. "He secures capital from investors for Project A, but instead of using it to build, he illegally commingles the funds to pay off the angry, litigious investors from Project B. He uses horribly substandard materials. We're talking severe structural risks, cheap drywall, and cracked foundations, and he bribes local municipal inspectors to look the other way so he can pass code." She paused, taking a breath. "But that's not even the worst part." She slid a glossy photograph across the desk. It was Marcus, grinning wildly, standing next to a brand new, custom white Lamborghini. Next to him was Chloe, holding a bottle of champagne. 2 years ago, Sarah continued, her voice grim, he received a massive $7.1 million capital injection from an anonymous blind trust. That money was legally restricted for commercial development and operational overhead. Instead, he funneled nearly $3 million of it into a subsidiary offshore account under his fiancée's name to avoid taxes. He used that stolen money to buy this Lamborghini for her. He used it to buy a luxury ski condo in Aspen. He used it to maintain the illusion of a billionaire lifestyle while his actual company hemorrhages cash daily. Without that anonymous angel investor's money propping him up, his company is entirely insolvent. He is actively committing federal wire fraud, tax evasion, and investor fraud. I stared down at the paperwork. The numbers didn't lie. They never do. My own brother had taken the money I gave him to save our parents' retirement, and he used it to buy luxury supercars and ski chalets. He was scamming innocent people out of their life savings. He was building houses that could literally collapse on the families living inside them. He was a monster wearing a tailored suit. Take them off the acquisition list, I told Sarah, my voice eerily calm, though a roaring fire had just ignited in my chest. Bury the file. Do not mention this to anyone in the firm. When she left the room, I locked the heavy wooden door. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the city below. I gripped the cold metal of the window sill until my knuckles turned stark white. The betrayal was a physical, crushing weight in my chest. It wasn't just that he was a criminal. It was the absolute disrespect for the sacrifice that had been made for him. For weeks, I agonized over what to do. Couldn't sleep. If I pulled my funding, his company would collapse instantly. The SEC would investigate. He would face severe prison time, and the ensuing scandal would destroy my parents' social standing. But if I let it ride, I was actively complicit in a massive, ongoing fraud. I decided to test the waters of my family's loyalty one last time. I called Uncle Robert, the supposed moral compass and elder statesman of the family, under the guise of asking for some career advice. I casually mentioned that I had read an article in the Wall Street Journal about real estate firms over-leveraging themselves, and asked if he thought Marcus was playing it safe. "Julian, please," Uncle Robert scoffed loudly through the phone, the sound of ice clinking in his glass. "Don't be jealous. It's beneath you. Marcus is a financial genius. You should be taking notes from him instead of worrying about his business practices. Focus on your little government pension and let the big boys handle the real money." That was the exact moment the remaining warmth in my heart turned to solid ice. There was no saving them. They didn't want to be saved. They wanted to worship a false idol. The final, explosive trigger was the phone call from my father, exactly 3 weeks before Thanksgiving. "Julian," my father had said, his tone dripping with unearned authority and condescension. "Your mother and I have been talking. The ranch is simply too much responsibility to leave in limbo. We are going to officially transfer the deed to Marcus at the Thanksgiving dinner. He has the capital, the vision, and the resources to develop it properly. I'm telling you now so you don't act surprised or make a scene at the dinner table. You're giving him grandfather's legacy?" I asked, my voice tight. "To bulldoze it for a subdivision?" "To improve it," my father corrected sharply. "To bring it into the modern century. Something you wouldn't understand with your limited worldview. Don't be bitter, Julian. We all have our roles in this family. Yours just isn't leadership." He hung up without saying goodbye. I didn't scream. I didn't throw my phone against the wall. I simply opened the locked bottom drawer of my desk and pulled out the thick manila folder Grandfather Harrison had given me 3 years ago. I ran my fingers over the embossed legal seal of the irrevocable trust. They wanted to play high-stakes business. Fine. I would show them what real, ruthless business actually looked like. The preparation for my revenge was incredibly meticulous. I didn't just want to pull the plug on his company. I wanted to ensure there was absolutely no legal blowback on me, and that the trap was perfectly, inescapably set. I called David into my office the next morning. We spent 4 grueling hours drafting the withdrawal demands. The strict terms of my anonymous investment trust had built-in clauses regarding financial mismanagement and criminal liability. Because Marcus had flagrantly breached his fiduciary duty by commingling funds and buying personal luxury assets with investor capital, I had the absolute legal right to execute an immediate, non-negotiable clawback of all remaining liquid capital in his accounts. If we execute this, Julian, Harrison Properties goes into immediate default, David warned, pushing his glasses up his nose as he reviewed the dense legal paperwork. We will have to notify the Securities and Exchange Commission simultaneously to protect your assets. It will trigger a massive federal audit. They will freeze his accounts within hours. Draft the SEC notification, I ordered, my voice devoid of any hesitation. Have it ready to send the exact moment the withdrawal clears. He's your brother? David said softly, looking up at me with concern. No, I replied, signing the authorization form with a heavy black pen. He is a liability, and I am liquidating him. The day of Thanksgiving finally arrived. The sky was an overcast, slate gray as I drove my modest, reliable sedan up the long, winding, tree-lined driveway of my parents' suburban estate. My stomach was a tight knot of anticipation and cold resolve. The very first thing I saw parked out front, taking up 2 spaces in the circular driveway, was Chloe's gleaming white Lamborghini. It caught the dull afternoon light, a glaring, obnoxious monument to my brother's theft. Every single curve of that car, every piece of leather inside it, was paid for by my money. Money stolen from the foundation of his failing company and the pockets of his trusting clients. I parked behind it, grabbed the $20 bottle of wine I had bought from the local grocery store, and walked inside the lion's den. The house was chaotic and loud. It pulsed with the suffocating energy of a family that thrives entirely on appearances and shallow victories. My mother rushed over the moment I stepped into the foyer, taking my coat but immediately fussing over my sweater. Oh, Julian, couldn't you have worn a blazer? She chastised, clicking her tongue in disapproval. Marcus is wearing a custom suit from Italy. We have guests. You look like you're going to a hardware store. It's turkey, Mom, not a corporate board meeting, I said dryly, stepping past her. I walked into the expansive living room. Marcus was holding court by the grand stone fireplace, exactly as I expected. He had a crystal glass of expensive bourbon in one hand and was gesturing wildly with the other, telling a loud, boastful story about a massive zoning victory he had supposedly just won against the city council. Chloe stood next to him, laughing entirely too hard at all the right moments, her massive, gaudy diamond engagement ring flashing in the firelight. Aunt Clara intercepted me near the appetizer table before I could reach the kitchen. Julian, so glad you made it, dear. How is whatever it is you do? Still filing reports for the state. Still filing, I said, picking up a piece of cheese and forcing a polite smile. Well, steady is good, she said, patting my arm condescendingly. We can't all be risk-takers like your brother. Someone has to be the turtle in the race. She leaned in, lowering her voice conspiratorially. Did you see Chloe's car outside? A Lamborghini. Marcus is just doing remarkably well. It's so nice that your parents finally have someone to carry on the family name properly and provide for them in their old age. I looked across the room at Marcus. He caught my eye mid-story and gave me a condescending little salute with his bourbon glass. He excused himself and walked over, throwing a heavy, patronizing arm around my shoulders. Little brother, glad you could make it out of the cubicle, Marcus boomed, ensuring everyone in the room could hear him. He squeezed my shoulder hard, a physical assertion of his perceived dominance. I'm making a big announcement at dinner tonight. You're going to want to hear this. I might even have a low-level property management job for you if you ever want to leave the boring government grind and make some real money. I'll keep that in mind, Marcus, I said, stepping smoothly and coldly out from under his arm. I checked my watch. It was 4 p.m. The domestic financial markets were closed for the holiday, but my wealth management firm operated globally, utilizing offshore routing that never slept. David was sitting at his computer in his London office right now, staring at a screen, waiting for my signal. Everything was in place. The legal documents, the SEC filings, and the irrevocable trust from Grandfather Harrison, sitting heavily like a loaded weapon in the inside pocket of my jacket. I was standing perfectly still in the eye of the hurricane. The air around me was calm. The family was smiling, oblivious to the impending doom. The turkey was being carved in the kitchen. They had absolutely no idea that a Category 5 financial storm was currently sitting in my outbox, waiting for a single, devastating tap of my thumb. When my father finally called everyone to the dining room table, I took my seat near the kitchen door. I placed my phone face up next to my water glass. I watched my mother serve the mashed potatoes with a silver spoon. I watched my father pour the expensive red wine. And then, my father tapped his glass. The room went silent, and my meticulously planned execution began. "What do you mean the escrow account is empty?" Marcus hissed into his sleek smartphone. His voice was a frantic, strained whisper that carried effortlessly across the sudden, dead silence of the dining room. My mother had literally frozen mid-motion, the heavy silver gravy boat suspended delicately over a steaming plate of mashed potatoes. Aunt Clara's jaw was slack, a piece of dinner roll halfway to her mouth. Uncle Robert had set his expensive Scotch glass down so hard the crystal clinked sharply against the mahogany wood, the amber liquid sloshing over the rim. Every single pair of eyes in the room was locked onto the family's golden child, watching the invincible, untouchable CEO crumble in real time. "Victor, listen to me," Marcus barked, his face turning from a sickly, pale ash gray to a mottled, panicked red. "Listen to me right now and stop hyperventilating. You call the bank manager. I have his direct cell number in the Rolodex. You tell him there has been a routing error. A massive, catastrophic routing error. The capital was locked in a blind trust. It is legally bound. Cannot just disappear into the ether on a Thursday afternoon. It is legally restricted for our commercial real estate overhead. Call the fraud department immediately. Tell them we've been hacked." He paused, listening to his chief financial officer on the other end of the line. The thick veins in Marcus's neck were bulging aggressively against the stiff collar of his custom Italian shirt. His breathing became shallow and erratic, like a man who had suddenly forgotten how to pull oxygen into his lungs. "A withdrawal demand?" Marcus shouted, entirely losing all pretense of his carefully cultivated executive composure. He was practically spitting the words. "Executed by who? We didn't authorize a clawback. Nobody from the board authorized anything. Who the hell authorized a $7 million clawback in the middle of Thanksgiving dinner?" I picked up my white linen napkin, folded it neatly into a perfect square, and placed it intentionally next to my dinner plate. The sound of my heavy wooden chair sliding back against the hardwood floor was loud enough to break the hypnotic trance that had fallen over the room. I stood up slowly. I didn't rush. I didn't smile. I didn't show a single ounce of the adrenaline that was currently surging through my veins. I let the absolute gravity of the moment settle over the table like a heavy, suffocating blanket of lead. I reached into the inside breast pocket of my gray cashmere sweater. I pulled out a thick, professionally bound document printed on heavy stock paper. It was the complete forensic accounting report my team had compiled, complete with SEC filing timestamps, offshore bank transfer logs, and copies of heavily doctored invoices. I tossed it onto the exact center of the table. It landed right next to the massive roasted turkey with a heavy, satisfying thud that made Aunt Clara physically jump in her seat. "Victor cannot call the bank manager, Marcus," I said. My voice was incredibly calm, remarkably steady, and it cut through his blind panic like a surgical steel scalpel. "The bank didn't make a routing error. Your accounts haven't been hacked. The fraud department cannot help you, and your CFO cannot stop the withdrawal process." Marcus slowly lowered the phone from his ear. His hand was shaking so violently he almost dropped the device. His eyes darted toward me, wide with wild, uncomprehending confusion. "Julian, sit down," he commanded, though his voice lacked any of its usual booming authority. "I am dealing with a massive corporate crisis right now. This is big boy business. This isn't your department. Let the adults handle this. I know exactly what kind of business it is, I replied, taking a deliberate step toward the center of the dining table. I authorized the clawback, Marcus. I pulled the funding. All $7.1 million of it. It's gone. It's out of your reach permanently. The room went so quiet you could hear the oak logs crackling in the fireplace on the other side of the living room. My father stood up abruptly, his face flushed with sudden, indignant anger. Julian, what is the meaning of this? My father demanded, puffing out his chest and using his best authoritative, patriarchal voice. What kind of sick, twisted joke are you playing? Your brother is dealing with a severe financial emergency, and you are trying to make it about yourself. It isn't a joke, Dad, I said, keeping my eyes locked dead on Marcus, watching the realization slowly begin to dawn behind his arrogant eyes. 3 years ago, when Harrison Properties was on the absolute brink of total bankruptcy, when you and Mom secretly mortgaged this house, when you drained your retirement accounts and the college funds you had set up for your future grandchildren just to bail him out, it wasn't enough. You didn't even scratch the surface of his debt. He was drowning. He was weeks away from losing everything and dragging your names through the mud. I pointed a firm finger directly at Marcus, who was now staring at me with a look of pure, unadulterated horror as the puzzle pieces began to forcefully lock together in his mind. I was the anonymous angel investor, I stated, my voice echoing clearly off the walls. I set up the Delaware Shell Company. I routed the money through David, my private wealth manager in London. I gave you $7.1 million of my own personal capital to save this family from financial ruin and public humiliation. I did it because, foolishly, I actually believed you wanted to build something legitimate. I wanted you to succeed. My mother let out a sharp, ragged gasp, dropping the gravy boat entirely. It hit the table with a clatter. The dark, rich brown liquid spilled violently across the pristine, hand-stitched white linen tablecloth, ruining the perfect holiday aesthetic she had spent 3 days obsessing over. You, Aunt Clara blurted out, her eyes wide, staring at me as if I had just grown a second head. Julian, that's impossible. You don't have that kind of money. You work a desk job for the government. You file reports for a living. I am a senior vice president of strategic acquisitions for a global private equity firm, Aunt Clara. I corrected her firmly, refusing to break eye contact with my brother. I evaluate, buy, and dismantle companies that make Harrison Properties look like a neighborhood lemonade stand. And exactly 8 months ago, my firm was formally asked by a third party to evaluate Marcus's company for a potential multimillion-dollar buyout. I gestured to the thick red document sitting ominously next to the ruined tablecloth. That is a certified forensic accounting audit, I said, projecting my voice so every single relative at the table could hear the undeniable truth. Because of conflict of interest regulations, I recused myself from the vetting process. But my elite team of auditors ripped his books apart line by line. And do you know what they found, Dad? They didn't find a visionary real estate developer. They found a criminal. They found a man running a massive textbook Ponzi scheme. Shut up, Marcus screamed, slamming his fist onto the table so hard the silverware rattled. Don't you dare listen to him. He's lying. He's jealous. He's always been intensely jealous of my success and my vision. There is no success, Marcus, I fired back, my voice rising just enough to completely dominate the acoustic space of the room. There is only theft. You take money from new, unsuspecting investors to quietly pay off the lawsuits from your old, angry investors. You use horribly substandard, dangerous materials in your builds. You bribe city inspectors to look the other way on cracked foundations. And worst of all, you flagrantly violated the strict legal terms of the fiduciary trust one set up to save you. I turned my intense gaze to Chloe. She was sitting rigidly in her antique chair, her heavily contoured face as white as a ghost, her hand instinctively covering the massive diamond engagement ring on her left hand as if I was about to snatch it from her. My capital was strictly, legally allocated for commercial development and operational overhead. I explained, letting the deep, profound disgust bleed into every syllable. Instead, Marcus funneled $3 million of it into an offshore subsidiary account registered in Chloe's name to illegally avoid federal taxes. He used my money to buy the custom white Lamborghini sitting in your driveway right now. He used my money to buy a luxury ski chalet in Aspen. He used my money to pay himself a massive, unearned salary so he could walk around town and pretend he was a titan of industry. Julian, that is quite enough, my father yelled, stepping menacingly toward me. His hands balled into tight fists. You are completely ruining Thanksgiving with these outrageous, slanderous lies. I will not have you disrespect your brother in this house. The SEC doesn't deal in lies, Dad, I said coldly, standing my ground. They deal in wire transfers. When I executed the withdrawal of my capital 15 minutes ago, the legal framework of my trust automatically triggered an immediate mandatory notification to the Securities and Exchange Commission in Washington. By Monday morning, his corporate accounts will be entirely frozen. There will be federal agents walking out of his shiny downtown office carrying boxes of hard drives. He is completely, irreversibly insolvent. Marcus collapsed back into his chair as if his strings had been cut. He looked like a man who had just been hit head-on by a speeding freight train. The smartphone slipped entirely from his sweaty fingers and clattered loudly onto the hardwood floor. You destroyed me, Marcus whispered, his voice trembling violently with a pathetic mix of impotent rage and absolute, bottomless terror. You actually destroyed my company. No, I corrected him, feeling a deep, profound sense of finality settling comfortably in my chest. A weight I had carried for years finally lifting. I just took my foundation out from underneath your fragile house of cards. You destroyed yourself. The grand, carefully curated illusion of the perfect, successful American family was officially dead on the dining room floor, bleeding out right next to Marcus's dropped cell phone. My mother began to cry, not the delicate, polite, easily dabbed tears she usually used to garner sympathy at country club luncheons, but harsh, ugly, breathless sobs of genuine, unadulterated panic. She rushed around the long table, nearly tripping over her expensive heels, and grabbed my arm. Her perfectly manicured fingers dug painfully into the soft wool of my cashmere sweater. Julian, please, she begged, her voice high-pitched, desperate, and cracking under the strain. Please, you have to stop this right now. Call your wealth manager back. Call him this second. Tell him it was a terrible mistake. Tell the government it was just a family misunderstanding. He is your brother, Julian. Your own flesh and blood. You have the money. You can fix this. If he goes to federal prison, the family name will be completely ruined. We will lose everything. The scandal will destroy us. I looked down at my mother's hands gripping my arm so tightly her knuckles were white. In that split second, I didn't see a grieving mother. I saw the reality of her affection. I thought about the decades I spent sitting quietly in the corner of this very house, swallowing my pride, suppressing my own achievements while she paraded Marcus around like a prize-winning thoroughbred. I remembered being bullied in high school, coming home with a bruised face, only for her to tell me to stop being so sensitive because Marcus had an important football game that weekend and I was ruining the mood. I thought about how effortlessly, how quickly she was willing to ask me to sacrifice my own professional integrity, my legal standing, and my hard-earned wealth just to protect her favorite son from the completely justified consequences of his own heinous crimes. She didn't care about the families Marcus had scammed. She didn't care about the contractors who hadn't been paid. She only cared about the family name. She only cared about the optics. I gently but incredibly firmly removed her hands from my arm and took a deliberate step back, creating a physical boundary between us. I cannot fix it, Mom, I said flatly, my voice devoid of any warmth. And even if I possessed the power to rewind time, I wouldn't do it. I gave him $7 million of my own money to build a lasting legacy. I gave him a lifeline that nobody else in the world would have given him. And he used it to buy a Lamborghini, live like a king, and commit felony fraud. I am officially done enabling him. I am done being the silent, invisible safety net for his massive ego. My father's face contorted into an incredibly ugly mask of pure, unbridled rage. The patriarch of the family couldn't handle the sudden, violent shift in power dynamics. He couldn't handle the undeniable fact that the son he had repeatedly dismissed as a loser, the son he had just publicly humiliated minutes ago, was standing in his dining room holding the executioner's axe over his golden child's neck. "You arrogant, ungrateful bastard." My father spat, pointing a trembling, furious finger inches from my face. "You think you can just waltz in here on a holiday, destroy your brother's life, tear this family apart, and act like you are the supreme moral authority? You are dead to me. Do you hear me? You are completely and utterly cut off from this family. I will contact the estate lawyer first thing tomorrow morning. You are officially written out of the will, and you can absolutely forget about getting your hands on a single acre of grandfather's ranch. The inheritance goes to Marcus to help him rebuild his business. Now get the hell out of my house." I stared at him. I let his hollow, desperate threats echo in the silent, tense room. This was the moment I had waited for. This was the exact, undeniable scenario Grandfather Harrison had predicted 3 years ago sitting on that creaking porch in the hill country. Grandfather knew exactly how they operated. I didn't flinch. I didn't raise my voice to match his screaming. I reached into the inside pocket of my jacket for the second time. I pulled out the heavy, legally bound manila folder that had been sitting in my office safe for 3 years. I held it up high for the entire room to see. "You cannot write me out of the inheritance regarding the ranch, Dad," I said, my voice dropping an octave, ringing with an absolute, unshakable authority that made him freeze. "And you certainly cannot give it to Marcus." My father scoffed, a nervous, erratic, dismissive sound. "I am the executor of your grandfather's estate, Julian. I make the final decisions. I hold the power." "No, you don't," I replied smoothly. I tossed the manila folder onto the table, placing it right on top of the red forensic accounting report. "That is an irrevocable trust document. It was signed, notarized, and legally filed with the county clerk 3 years ago by Grandfather Harrison. He knew exactly what Marcus was. He knew Marcus was a fraud who would pave over a century of our family's history just to make a quick buck and fund his lifestyle. And more importantly, Grandfather knew that you would stand by and let him do it. My father stared down at the folder as if it were a highly venomous snake coiled on his dining table. He didn't move to touch it. His bravado was rapidly evaporating, replaced by a creeping dread. "For those who don't understand trust law," I said, addressing the room but keeping my eyes on my father, "an irrevocable trust cannot be modified, amended, or terminated without the permission of the grantor's named beneficiary. Grandfather legally transferred the deed of the entire 800-acre estate, all the mineral rights beneath it, the livestock, and the farming equipment directly into my name before he died. The ranch is already mine. It has been legally mine for years. I am the sole, uncontested legal owner." I took a step closer to my father, lowering my voice so only he could feel the true weight of my words. "You have absolutely no legal standing to give it to anyone, Dad. You were essentially sitting at the head of this table, acting like a king, offering Marcus a piece of property that belongs entirely to me." The silence that followed was completely deafening. It was the sound of a total structural paradigm shift. The hierarchy of the family had just been permanently inverted. He lied to us?" my mother whispered, looking at the folder in utter disbelief, her hands covering her mouth. "Your grandfather lied to us for years?" "He didn't lie," I corrected her softly, though the words carried a sharp sting. "He just didn't trust you. He wanted me to see exactly how you would treat me when you thought you held all the power. He wanted me to see who you really were. And tonight you showed me with absolute clarity. You publicly humiliated me, you mocked my career, you praised a criminal, and you actively tried to steal my land to give it to him." I looked around the room. Uncle Robert was staring intensely at his expensive leather shoes, refusing to make eye contact. Aunt Clara looked like she desperately wanted to melt into the floorboards and disappear. Chloe was frantically texting someone on her phone, entirely ignoring Marcus, who was sitting with his head buried in his hands, completely and utterly broken. "I am setting a permanent boundary right here, right now," I said, my voice echoing in the large dining room. "I am walking out that front door. I will not pay for any defense lawyers. I will not post his bail. I will not answer any of your phone calls when the press gets hold of the bankruptcy filings on Monday. You chose your visionary. You chose your golden child. Now you can deal with the fallout together." I turned my back on them and walked out of the dining room. I didn't look back when my mother started screaming my name, her voice cracking in pure hysteria. I didn't stop walking when I heard the distinct sound of a crystal wine glass shattering violently against the wall. I walked out the front door, into the crisp, biting evening air, and as I walked toward my car, I felt lighter than I had in 34 years. Let's pause for a moment. Thank you for staying with me this far. You're truly amazing. Please help me by liking the video and commenting the number 1 below so I know you've been here with me until this point. This not only helps more people discover this story, but also lets me know that my experiences mean something to someone. Your support is the greatest motivation for me to keep sharing the rest of this journey. The fallout from that Thanksgiving dinner was swifter, far more brutal, and vastly more public than even my most cynical financial projections had anticipated. By early Monday morning, the news had officially hit the local business journals and the regional financial papers. The headlines were utterly merciless, plastered across every screen in the city. Harrison Properties files emergency Chapter 11 bankruptcy amid sweeping federal fraud probe. Local real estate wunderkind accused of multi-million-dollar Ponzi scheme. The Securities and Exchange Commission moved with terrifying, bureaucratic efficiency. Because my withdrawal had triggered an automatic fraud alert tied to a federally regulated blind trust, they didn't waste time with subpoenas. They moved straight to asset freezing. Every single corporate account, payroll account, and personal bank account linked to Marcus was locked down before he even finished his morning coffee. At 9 a.m. sharp, a team of federal agents in dark windbreakers walked into the shiny, glass-walled downtown office of Harrison Properties. They ordered the shocked employees to step away from their desks. They spent 6 hours carrying out boxes of physical ledgers, hard drives, and server towers. The image of Marcus being escorted out of his own building, looking disheveled and pale, was broadcast on the local noon news. Marcus's carefully constructed world evaporated overnight. The wealthy, elite investors who had previously praised his supposed genius at country club galas were now lining up with high-powered, ruthless attorneys to file massive civil lawsuits. The local contractors, the plumbers, the electricians, the carpenters, who had been continuously stiffed on their payments, immediately padlocked the active construction sites, spray-painting "thief" across the plywood boards of his half-built luxury homes. But the deepest, most devastating betrayal for Marcus didn't come from the government or the angry courts. It came from inside his own house. Chloe, the woman who had happily spent stolen investor money on designer clothes, first-class flights, and luxury vacations, proved very quickly that her loyalty was entirely transactional. The moment the SEC began aggressively looking into the offshore subsidiary accounts registered in her name, she panicked. She realized she was facing potential jail time as an accessory to wire fraud. She didn't stand by her man. Instead, she hired a ruthless, highly expensive criminal defense attorney and immediately struck a deal with the federal prosecutors. In exchange for full legal immunity and a promise of no jail time, Chloe handed over absolutely everything. She provided the secondary hidden ledgers. She handed over thousands of incriminating emails. She provided text messages where Marcus explicitly admitted to using new investor money to pay off old debts. She handed the prosecution a perfectly wrapped, undeniable case. She broke off the engagement via a formal, cold letter delivered by her lawyer to Marcus's holding cell. She packed her designer bags and left him. But she didn't get to keep the spoils of his crimes. The federal government ensures that crime doesn't pay, at least not when they catch you. I received a highly satisfying update from David, my wealth manager, 2 weeks later. The bank, working in direct tandem with the Federal Asset Forfeiture Division, moved aggressively to repossess all the luxury vehicles bought with the stolen funds. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon. The custom white Lamborghini was loaded onto a heavy flatbed tow truck right out of my parents' suburban driveway, where Chloe had abandoned it to avoid being seen with it. My mother had to stand on the porch and watch it happen in front of the entire neighborhood. Marcus's beloved, jet black Porsche suffered the exact same humiliating fate, towed away from his luxury downtown condo while local news cameras, tipped off by an anonymous source, filmed the entire spectacle. My parents were utterly, comprehensively devastated. The pristine social standing they had spent decades meticulously cultivating crumbled to dust in a matter of days. They could no longer attend their prestigious country club dinners. They couldn't show their faces at the neighborhood homeowners association meetings without facing the burning, judgmental stares of people who had actively lost their life savings investing in their son's fraudulent company. Worse still, the financial reality set in. Because my parents had secretly mortgaged their fully paid-off home to bail Marcus out in the early days of his failing business, they were now facing a severe financial crisis of their own. The bank called in the loan. With Marcus's assets frozen and the civil lawsuits piling up, there was no money to pay the mortgage. The comfortable retirement they had planned, the safety net they thought they had, was entirely gone. They were forced to put the house up for sale at a massive loss just to avoid foreclosure. I watched it all unfold from a distance, reading the legal briefs and the news articles from the quiet comfort of my office. I felt absolutely no joy in their suffering. I took no pleasure in watching my parents lose their home. But simultaneously, I felt absolutely no guilt. I had tried to save them. I had given them 7 million reasons to succeed. They had chosen to worship the illusion of success instead of respecting the reality of hard work. They had dug their own graves, and I was simply refusing to jump in the hole with them. Instead of dwelling on the destruction of my past, I poured every ounce of my energy into the creation of my future. I took a prolonged, 6-month leave of absence from the private equity firm. I packed up my apartment in Austin and moved out to the ranch permanently. I walked the 800 acres of rolling, green hills, breathing in the scent of the dry Texas earth, the wildflowers, and the ancient oak trees. I hired Thomas, the gruff, fiercely loyal ranch manager who had worked the land for my grandfather for 30 years. Together, sitting on the porch with architectural blueprints spread over the table, we drafted a comprehensive, 5-year master plan. We modernized the agricultural operations. We implemented sustainable, eco-friendly grazing practices. And we began the careful, loving restoration of the main farmhouse, preserving its historical integrity. Your grandfather would be incredibly proud of you, Julian, Thomas told me one late afternoon, leaning against a newly repaired cedar fence, looking out over the herd. He knew you had the spine for this. He knew you wouldn't let the corporate vultures pick the bones of this place clean. I didn't pave over the creek. I didn't bulldoze the old barn to build a soulless subdivision. I preserved the history, honoring the blood, sweat, and tears that had built our family legacy in the first place. I was finally building something real, something that would last for generations, and I was doing it entirely on my own terms. 6 months passed, turning the page on the darkest chapter of my life. The harsh, bitter winter gave way to a bright, vibrant Texas spring. The bluebonnets bloomed across the ranch, painting the hillsides in deep, beautiful purples and blues. Marcus was officially indicted by a federal grand jury on 34 counts of wire fraud, tax evasion, and defrauding investors. Because of the overwhelming evidence, mostly provided by his ex-fiancée Chloe, his legal team advised him to take a plea deal. He was facing significant federal prison time, likely a minimum of 8 to 10 years. His high-priced defense attorneys were bleeding my parents dry, taking whatever small scraps of savings they had left after the sale of their home. They had moved into a small, cramped apartment on the outskirts of the city. Meanwhile, my career reached heights I had never even dreamed of. Richard, the CEO of my private equity firm, formally announced my promotion to executive managing director of the entire Southern Division. I was featured on the cover of a prominent national financial magazine, recognized for successfully navigating an incredibly complex, billion-dollar corporate merger that completely reshaped the commercial real estate landscape across 3 states. The article highlighted my relentless analytical mind and my unshakable composure under pressure. The exact day the magazine hit the newsstands across the country, my cell phone rang. I looked at the caller ID. It was my mother. I didn't answer. I let it ring until it went to voicemail. I sat at my massive, hand-carved oak desk in the newly renovated study at the ranch, looking out the large bay window at the horses grazing peacefully in the pasture. I tapped the screen and played the voicemail on speakerphone. Julian. My mother's voice trembled through the tiny speaker. She sounded incredibly old, deeply exhausted, and uncharacteristically fragile. The haughty arrogance was completely gone. I saw the article in the magazine at the grocery store today. We are so incredibly proud of you. We always knew you were smart. Your father and we were wondering if you would be willing to meet us for coffee this weekend. We miss you terribly. The apartment is so quiet. And Marcus's legal fees. We are struggling so much, Julian. We really need our family to be united right now. Please call me back. We love you. I listened to the recording twice. I analyzed the cadence of her voice, the carefully chosen words. I heard the genuine desperation, yes, but beneath the tears, I also heard the familiar, insidious manipulation. They didn't want to reconnect because they had finally seen the error of their ways. They didn't want to apologize for decades of emotional neglect or the horrifying way they treated me at Thanksgiving. They wanted to reconnect because their golden child was a convicted felon awaiting sentencing. They wanted to reconnect because their bank accounts were entirely empty. They wanted to reconnect because the son they had publicly humiliated and discarded was now a recognized, wealthy titan of industry with deep pockets. They didn't want a son. They needed a new savior to fund their mistakes. I picked up my phone. I didn't call her back. I didn't send a text. I navigated to her contact profile and pressed block. I did the same for my father's number. I blocked Aunt Clara, Uncle Robert, and every other relative who had sat at that table and laughed at my expense. I systematically severed the final, toxic threads that tied me to a family that only valued me for what I could provide, rather than who I actually was. Boundary setting isn't just about saying no when someone asks for a favor. It is a profound act of self-preservation. It is about actively, ruthlessly protecting your peace, your integrity, and your future from people who are fiercely committed to misunderstanding you. My family wanted a low-level paper pusher they could mock to feel better about themselves, or a silent, endless wallet they could drain to fund their delusions. I firmly refused to be either. That evening, as the workday came to a close, I stepped out onto the expansive wraparound porch of the restored farmhouse. The sun was setting, painting the massive, endless Texas sky in brilliant, sweeping strokes of fiery orange, deep purple, and bruised red. The air was cool and smelled of fresh pine and distant rain. I held a heavy crystal glass of Grandfather Harrison's favorite neat whiskey. I took a slow sip, letting the familiar burn settle in my chest. I looked out over the sprawling acres of land that were legally, undeniably mine. I didn't win this land by fighting my family in a bitter, drawn-out court battle. I didn't win it by endlessly seeking their approval, or by trying to shout my worth across a crowded dinner table to people who were determined not to listen. I won it because I stayed incredibly quiet. I worked relentlessly hard in the shadows. I built real, undeniable skills. And when the time came, I simply allowed the absolute truth to be my ultimate weapon. I stepped back and let the garbage take itself out. Sometimes the absolute most powerful thing a man can do in this world is to calmly stand up, push his chair back, and walk away from a table where respect is no longer being served. Thank you for joining me on this journey today. Healing from deep family betrayal is never a straight line, and setting firm boundaries with the very people who raised you is, without a doubt, one of the hardest, most agonizing things you will ever have to do in your life. But I promise you, from the bottom of my heart, the absolute peace and clarity you find on the other side is worth every single difficult step. Have you ever faced something similar with your own family? Have you ever had to walk away from a toxic dynamic to save yourself and your own sanity? Share your story in the comments below. I read every single one of them, and your courage in sharing helps others realize they are not alone in their struggles. And don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss the next journey we take together. Until next time, stay strong, know your absolute worth, and aggressively protect your peace.